Okay, so it's January 2021, and we just had a terrible thing happen in the US. Some people stormed our Capitol. And I guess some of how they organized that attack was through a social network called Parler, which is a conservative social media network. And so, in response to that, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple all went after Parler and shut it down, which brought up an interesting discussion on Twitter, which was with Parler getting shut down from AWS, they claimed that they could migrate to another cloud provider within a week. Some people thought that that was ridiculous, and it would, for a multi-cloud migration, it would take a minimum of a month. And then people like me thought it actually should be fairly easy to migrate from one to the other if you're not using cloud-specific technology. So if you're on AWS and you're using Cognito, SQS, DynamoDB, all of that, then it would be difficult. But if you were using standard technology that you would run on your local computer, so if you're using Postgres, Python, Node.js, Docker, the migration should be easy. And so I decided to create a series. I'm going to start from the beginning. Introduction to Docker. This is how you create a container, run it, get Nginx, Python, JavaScript all inside it, and then I'll move it into the cloud, and then we'll migrate it from, let's say, AWS to DigitalOcean. So as an intro to Docker, I want to start with, what is the benefit of Docker? The benefit of Docker is that it is a reproducible, shareable component that is a set of infrastructure. So said another way, it is a reproducible operating system that you can move from place to place. So I could have my web application running locally on a MacBook and then take that same image and move it into AWS Cloud and run it there. And it will be the exact same. There won't be any changes of this works on my machine. It is a recipe to make a reproducible environment so that I can develop on it and then have that development work in production as well. And so the other benefit is we basically have a package management tool. So if you're used to Python with pip and PyPI, you can just pip install a package and get it. Node.js, same thing with npm and yarn. Yarn install MongoDB, and then you have a driver for the MongoDB database. So Docker has a registry of images. Images are produced operating systems that can be running a process. So you can download an image that has Node.js already installed, or Nginx, or Python, or Rust. You can have it with MySQL or Postgres. And so the open source community has embraced this, and they've created official documents or official images that you can just download and tinker with and modify. So it gives you a really nice base to start with. So if you look here right now, I'm on hub.docker.com. And that gives you the ability to search and download reusable Docker images. So here I've searched for Nginx, and you can see there's an official image for Nginx. Nginx is a reverse proxy for running web servers. And so you can just drill into this and see if it's one that you would want to use just by itself, or one that you would want to base your image off of. So it has the latest Nginx version and these tags that are for a Docker file. A Docker file is the recipe for creating an image. So you declare all of the commands that you want to run, they will run, and then when you build it, it'll produce an image that you can then send to other people or pushed to the cloud. So let's look at how Nginx is declaring their Docker file to generate their images. So the first line is usually to create an inheritance tree, to say, I want to base my image off of another image. You can also say from scratch and just start from a blank distribution. Or if you're familiar with BusyBox, BusyBox is a very small distribution of Linux. You could even say from BusyBox and start from that and then build your way up. So Nginx, they've started with Debian's Buster Slim. This provides them a nice ability to have a small distribution of Linux that they can then start installing. So the Dockerfile syntax is usually a verb on the left and then a noun on the right. So from Debian Buster. So let's start with everything they have. Then let's create some environment variables so that our software can use them when it's producing the packages. And then you start running your commands inside your operating system. This is very common things when setting up a Linux distribution or setting up a server in the cloud or locally. Creating users, creating groups, installing packages, all of that. And so the way Nginx is working is they're just in a standard Debian distribution in their apt-get installing all of their packages. And then after they have their operating system set up, they have all the packages installed, then they're going to copy files from the host. So this is your computer. You would have a Docker entry point sh file, and they'd copy it to root. And then they are also going to copy over a few other things. And then that's basically it. Install, put files you want on it, and then run a command. They're just going to run the Nginx command, and it's just going to stay running. And that's the special trick with the Docker file is this CMD. That's the process one of the distribution. So as long as that does not exit, your container will continue to run. If it does exit, your container will shut down. And so let's go locally and tinker with this a little bit. So the way you communicate with the Docker Hub registry or other registries. So Docker Hub is not the only registry. So if you look at Amazon AWS container, so they have, let's do ECR. So the ECR is the Amazon Elastic Container Registry. It's very similar to the Docker Hub. They just provide their own images for creating these Docker containers. So you can pull from the Docker Hub or you can pull from the ECR. Either way, you're going to get reusable images that you can produce containers out of. So the way you get images is you just pull them. So like the one we were just looking at was called Nginx. So if I say Docker pull Nginx, it's going to check. So this says I'm already at the latest. So if I want to verify what images I have locally right now, I just look. Okay, so I have a few Python ones, some Node ones, and Nginx. So now if I want to run an image, turn it into a container, you just Docker run. And then we can make it interactive so that we can work on it. So we can say Nginx and then we can say bin bash. This is going to run the container and then drop me into a bash shell inside the container. So now I have left my host computer and I'm in this one. And you can see the Docker entry point and the Docker shell, the files that we saw in that Docker file. And so you can actually check the Nginx config, and it has a full Nginx config in here. So let's exit out of that. But as you saw, when I ran this, I replaced that command that they were running. By default, they were running Nginx and have an int be the main process of the container. I said, don't run that. Run bin bash instead. If I want to use the default command, just run it like that. And now I have Nginx running. I cannot access it from my host, but it is running. So for example, if I come in here, I can say, well, first, let's check that it's running. So Docker PS or Docker container ls. You can see that there is a container running and its name is Loving Brown. So if you don't name a container, by default, it's going to give you something like a verb and then a scientist name. So Loving Brown. And so if you want to name this to make it a little easier, you just come in here and you say name, and we can say Sontech Nginx. So if I come back here and check again, so now I have this container, Sontech Nginx. So if I want to communicate with it, let's say I want to, because if we go back to this Docker container or Docker file, you can see it says expose 80. That means I am opening port 80 in this container. I'm exposing it. So you would want to communicate with it. But from your host, you cannot communicate with that. But you can check that it is running by so now we're in the Sontech Nginx container that is running. So now if we hit localhost 80, you can see that web server is running. So how do we get it exposed to the container or to the host so that we can communicate with that container? You just do what's called a port map. So if we want to expose a local port on my machine that routes to the container, you do -p and then say the port that's local. So let's say we're going to make a port 8080 locally, go to port 80 in the container. Oh, and we already have a container going. So that's one thing, is these containers, when they stop, if you look, says that the container's not running, right? But the trick is that it is actually running. So you can see here, I actually have a few, not running, but it still exists. And you can't create a new one with the same name if it still exists. So you can say Docker container rm, and then you can say delete Nginx. But what you really want to do by default is when you're running these, just say when I exit, delete me. So --rm. That says if I run this container and it exits, delete it. Don't leave it laying around. And this cleanup is very important, because otherwise you're going to have years worth of containers and bookkeeping information just sitting around on your computer. You should have seen how many containers or images I've had on a single computer as I've been running these. So always --rm unless you have a reason to keep it around. So now we ran Sontech Nginx. So now if I come back in here, curl localhost 80, Nginx is running inside the container, and then outside the container, I cannot access it. So let's look at why we can't access it. Oh, because we named the port 8080, not 80. So come back here. Now we're going to hit localhost 8080. On my computer, I want to communicate to the Docker container. Boom, now we're communicating with Nginx. So that's really useful, because now I didn't have to install any packages. I'm on OS 10 right now. Sometimes I use Windows, sometimes I use Linux. I don't want to have to install Nginx all over the place. Now I can just run a container on whatever operating system I'm on, and I've exposed my reverse proxy. So, but exposing it by itself isn't that useful. What you would really want to do is customize it. So if we come over here, let's create a Docker file. And we want to say from Nginx. So we're going to create our own custom image so that we can put new files in it, expose new ports, all of that. And then what do we want to do? Let's put up a new file. Let's create an index.html and put it in, oh, well, I don't even know where to put it. So let's do docker run nginx bin bash. Let's figure out where we need to put files in here. So if we check nginx conf-d, this is going to say, I'm going to, at the root of my web server, I'm going to load any static files out of this folder. User share nginx HTML. So let's copy index.html to user share nginx HTML. So we're going to put an nginx file or an HTML file into this path. So let's create an HTML file. All right, so now that we have a Docker file and an index.html file, how do we create our own custom image? With Docker build. So, and then we're going to name it. So let's just call it Sontech Nginx. So now, if we look at Docker images, you can see we have a Sontech Nginx image. So let's run that. You have to have the port forwarding before the name. There we go. So when we hit localhost 8080, it says welcome to our image. So that was easy enough. So what could you do with your custom image? So you can commit this Docker file to Git, push it up, send it to other people. All they have to do is run docker build. Then they have the same image and they're going to get the same experience. Or you can push it up to the registry and other people can pull it right down from there. And so you could actually use this to deploy your containers to production. So if we wanted to serve up this HTML file from DigitalOcean, from AWS, it'd be as easy as pushing it. So we say docker push Sontech Nginx. And then if we go back to the Docker Hub, we'll see that we've now created our own Nginx. So look, right here, updated a few seconds ago, Sontech/Nginx. And as you can see, this is exposed as docker pull Sontech Nginx. So if you wanted to deploy this to production, you just come here to something like DigitalOcean. One of many, Linode is just as good. And you just create a droplet. Usually you'd use SSH keys, not password. We're just going to do this quickly as an example. So create the droplet. Takes a couple of seconds to spin up this server. So I'll come back once this is done and we have shell access. Okay, so DigitalOcean has created us a new cloud server with this IP address. So all you have to do is copy that IP address and SSH into it. So It says permission denied, public key. It's trying to use the public keys. The provisioning around DigitalOcean, they set the passwords and everything after the fact. So that means we're a little early, but we can just try again. There we go. So now we're in. So by default, these images do not have Docker, but it's an Ubuntu distribution. So to get Docker, you apt update, apt install Docker, and there are different repositories for Docker with Debian distributions in general. Docker creates their own, but Debian ships with one as well. So that we don't have to pull down the official one, even though Docker CE is probably a better route to go, we can just say, and it's going to work the same. It's going to have all the same tools we just went over. You're going to have Docker CLI, you're going to have a Docker daemon that's running, all of that. So you're going to be able to pull down Docker images and run them right from here. And this isn't the perfect way to go. I'll create another video of the better way to go when we're talking about cloud migrations. This is just the quick and dirty, how can I create a Docker image, deploy it to production? If we were provisioning these servers, we would use something like Ansible, a configuration management system, to install Docker and make sure it's running and configured properly. We would create users so that we're not running everything as root. We would do a lot of things differently. We would set up a firewall so that we're only listening on the ports that we want to listen to. Okay, so Docker is done being installed. It is currently not running. You can check systemctl is how you check if processes are running in Ubuntu. So it is currently disabled, which means it will not start if this virtual machine is rebooted. So you usually want to enable it so that it will start if we reboot it. And then we also just want to start it. So now that Docker's running, we can do what we did before. Docker pull Sontic Nginx. That's going to pull down each of these layers. You can see each of these hashes are versioned layers that are defined in this Docker file. Each of those lines in that Docker file are a versioned layer. So we have the layer from the Nginx, the from Nginx line that we have for all the stuff it's doing, and then we have all the stuff we're doing, copying that file over, setting our commands, everything. So now that we have it, now we can run it. And this time, again, you have to do the port map before you give it the name. So I'm going to say map my host port 80 to the container port 80. That way we can actually access Nginx in the container from port 80 on the host. All right, she's running. So if we come back here and we grab this port, welcome to our image. We now have a public website being ran from a Docker container. So there's a lot of things that we need to update here because we didn't secure it. Like we're still HTTP, not HTTPS. It is currently running just in this shell. So if I wanted to leave this shell, leave the SSH session, the container is going to shut down. The old school way of doing this would just be run screen, right? So you could run screen and then Docker run and now if I close this, it'll continue to run until the server's rebooted. And then I would have to shell back in and start it again. So this is not the best way to do this. as well. It's just the quick and easiest way to show you how to get started. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to create multiple containers, a front end, a back end, and a database, how to get them communicating with each other, and then how to set up your server so that it's starting all of these containers or all these services when it reboots as well.